Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Evening Conversations at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at Connecticut's Old State House. And I want to welcome you all to our program tonight, The Many Colors of Justice, Black New Englanders in Connecticut's Colonial Courts. Today we have a returning guest who will be speaking to us about his research in New London's county courts as it pertains to the enslaved and free Black citizens that were living there during colonial times. So we have our guest, Dominic DeBrincat, who is the Assistant Dean of Liberal Arts at Missouri Western State University, where he is also an Associate Professor of History. His research is in early American law with particular interest in Connecticut and New London County. He received his law degree from Wayne State University in Detroit and his PhD in history from the University of Connecticut. And he is also a member of the Connecticut State Bar. So, Dominic, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so you have the floor.
Oh, I will take the floor. Thanks for having me back again. I really enjoyed presenting with you last time, so I was excited to have an opportunity to return. Tonight, I'm going to talk about Black experiences in colonial Connecticut courts, with particular emphasis on New London County and their courts, which is in southeastern Connecticut. And the cases that I'm looking at are all drawn from a range from 1700 to 1750. So I thought I'd start with just a little statement about the research, and then if you have some questions, we can talk about some of my findings. While colonists were fully aware of color distinctions and surely discriminated on such grounds, skin color and servile status rarely seemed to prejudice legal outcomes at the county level in Connecticut. Participating as plaintiffs, defendants, third-party subjects, when they came to the county court in the first half of the 18th century, Blacks often relied on these courts to protect their economic and social interests, especially when discrimination in the community limited their ability to settle disputes informally. The available evidence suggests that once free people of color made their way into the courtroom, they were treated like other community members. They had access to legal forms and due process before bench and jury. Judges, jurors, and court officials seem to have treated Blacks with a fairness that one might expect to be reserved just for whites. They offered reasonable judgments and reasonable awards. All told, the court tried to reconcile whites' interests in preserving their livelihoods and promoting local peace, along with Blacks' interests in maintaining economic opportunities, their family ties, and when possible, personal freedom. For the most part, free Blacks entered the shadow of the law, where court officials and jurors seemed to act less colorblind than the rest of colonial society. This fairness helped to undercut African descendants' inferior status, even if for just brief moments. Black people's access to due process and equitable treatment created an important paradox in colonial North America. In the courtroom, court magistrates and juries acknowledged a Black person's individual worth as a legal agent, exercising free will to engage in legal resources and engage with fellow litigants in court. Yet outside the courtroom, such equality was hard to be found. Though court rulings did not always benefit Black people, judges and juries did not appear to overly rely on perceptions of social inferiority. Instead, their rulings reinforced free Blacks' identities as active participants in colonial Connecticut's legal system. The courtroom also offers a window into the lives of enslaved Blacks. While not necessarily entering the court as litigants, enslaved people regularly appeared as third-party subjects to court proceedings. As white colonists enjoyed the freedom to secure their own social reputations and economic successes by way of the legal system, judges faced cases directly antithetical to considerations of freedom. They handled cases of rightful ownership, fraudulent slave sales, even the theft of laborers. Beyond litigating their statuses, Blacks occasionally appeared in court to testify in cases of civil and criminal matters. Issues like trespass, servant conversion, varied forms of debt. In these cases, their voices actually mattered. Their servile status didn't necessarily discount their credibility. As third-party subjects and helpful witnesses, Black participants forced colonists to face the realities of molding conceptions of fairness around a social system that was built on obvious inequalities. Colonial Connecticut, and particularly New London County, is ripe for legal study because of its diverse population, especially its significant numbers of Black and Indian New Englanders. The presence of significant numbers of people of color may have made some whites more anxious about the maintenance of social order, more so than in other counties. Included in the general colonial population were a sizable number of free Blacks who interacted regularly with community members of all colors. Their economic transactions added to the litigated economy. One factor behind Black people's economic activity and confidence was the willingness of many whites to participate with them in the marketplace. Some white families, such as the Rogerses of New London, were friends of the Black community. They emancipated some of their servants and expended time and energy to preserve Black freedoms, even while still holding enslaved and indentured laborers of their own. So when we look at New London County, it's not surprising that cases involving Blacks appear quite regularly during the colonial period. Okay, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Dominic. That was a great overview of something I think does not get talked about very often, a lot about the Black experience during colonial times, particularly in the county courts specifically. So I think that we can start just by you telling us how you started to look into these cases and research these cases.
When I was a young pup grad student at UConn, in my first year, I devised a project. I was going to study the county courts to study murder cases involving Black people in Connecticut. It turns out I was very disappointed because I had no idea how the county courts worked and didn't realize, murder cases aren't going to show up there. But while I was fruitlessly doing research, one of the assistant archivists, Bruce Stark, pulled me aside. He had been working on a specific collection of African descendant records that he had been compiling with a grant that he had received when he was processing New London County court records. And so before he had even drafted the official collection, he shared with me his notes, and I was able to dive into the records, not necessarily having to look for Black participants, but I was able to single them out by going case to case that he had already identified. That research project turned into an article, which I later turned into a dissertation chapter. And then in the last few years, I revised that chapter as part of a possible book project. So the Black Experience research project has been following me around, for probably like 20 years now.
All right. Thank you. And so one of the biggest sections in your study was civil debt cases. And that's one of the kinds of cases that Blacks were most commonly found in the court records. So before we dive into those cases, could you tell us what a debt case is and how it looked like back in colonial times?
Sure. The majority of the cases, roughly 70% of all civil cases, are made up of debt cases. Debt was pretty common, especially in the absence of any formal cash or any hard money like gold, silver, or even Spanish coins. So people operated in a world where they exchanged debt to sustain the economy. For the purposes of this talk today, we can say that debt really appeared in two principal forms, either book debt or what I'll call paper debt or note debts. Book debt was built on kind of like a memory economy when neighbors worked with each other. If I went to my neighbor and said that I needed something and there was a value to it, my neighbor might actually have a physical debt book where they would write entries in there saying, I gave them, a plow for £4 or something like that. And that book would serve as kind of evidence of a record of some debt exchange. The person who held that debt could call on it at any time, much like a store tab or a bar tab. And if I wasn't able to pay, they could take me to court and they would open the book in court and say, see, right here, they agreed to pay me back. And that could be used as proof against me. As people started doing more dealings with strangers, paper debts became more common. Paper debts or note debts, they were slips of paper that recorded debts, sometimes on pre-printed forms. And these are a lot like IOUs. They usually carried interest and penalties if you didn't pay by a specific time. And so these debt cases, for the most part, went uncontested. Most people knew that they owed some people money and they just didn't answer to it. Think about any of you out there who had student loans and maybe you didn't open every piece of mail that came to you. That debt still existed regardless. And so court proceedings regarding debt was a way to record debt and to get legal officials to actually enforce those unpaid debts. So those two forms make up the bulk of the actions related to debt.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so one of the people that you talk about in your research, who you call one of the most prolific Black litigants in civil debt cases in New London, was Robert Jacklin. So can you tell us a little bit about Robert Jacklin and all of his cases?
Yeah, Robert Jacklin is an excellent case study because he represents in one figure most of my findings involving Blacks in debts. Blacks clearly were able to engage with whites in getting debt, but as Jacklin shows, and other litigants as well, that some Black people were actually solvent enough and kind of skilled enough to extend credit themselves. Jacklin himself was the most prolific debt litigator in my study. He appeared in 25 cases. He was fairly active as a farmer. He had been previously enslaved in Massachusetts, and he moved down into Connecticut, tried to purchase land of his own, but wasn't very successful. So as a free man, he ended up working on Jonathan Rogers' farm. And worked essentially as a renter on that land as a farmer. He filed, of the cases that showed up, he filed at least 5 cases as a lender himself. One of the problems with debt cases is that they don't often tell us what the debts are for. In note debt, they almost never tell us. And book debts will always tell us, but the clerk doesn't often make a copy of what the book looks like. So we don't always know what these debts are for. But there was one case that said that he did enter into debt for fencing staves. And that means that he was at least using them to either fence in part of his property or probably fence in livestock. And in those cases, the 5 that he filed himself to bring in debts, that he was able to recover. The court agreed with him and supported his claims, and he was able to recover in all 5 of those cases. Unfortunately for Jacklin, though, he was also more frequently a debtor. He appeared at least 20 times in the record as a debtor. And these are just mostly general debts, either for cash that he needed or maybe services rendered. But there was one real sizable example. After he moved out of New London, he went to Colchester, and his former landlord, Jonathan Rogers, sued him for back rent for the dwelling, the fields, the livestock, and it was pretty sizable. It was about £197, which is a lot of money for the 1720s. When he went to the New London court, he pleaded that he owed no debt, that he had paid as expected, and he lost in New London. But he appealed it. He used the court procedures. He appealed it to the Superior Court, and the Superior Court overturned that ruling, saying that the lower court had failed to consider his pleadings appropriately. And that case doesn't return to the records, which suggests he and Rogers struck a deal outside of court, or maybe Rogers gave up. Probably not likely with that large of a sum, though.
Great, thank you. So really, these cases really show how entwined Black and white inhabitants in colonial New England were just entwined, right? And how economically they were always dealing with each other. So what do these cases tell us about the daily lives of free Blacks in New London in their relationship with their white neighbors?
These New London cases give us a really good example of what a society with slaves looked like. If we compare it to Southern slave societies that were built on large plantation growing, slaveholders held claim to so many laborers that they ended up segregating their lives, their living spaces, in many cases, their workspaces, especially for those who were committed to the fields. But the relationship between Blacks and whites in a society with slaves like New England really shows a much more intimate world. Folks who laid claim to laborers might have one in their household, maybe up to 10, but they usually tended to be very small holdings, which meant that they didn't set up separate campuses or buildings for their enslaved laborers to live. Folks usually lived with their enslaved laborers in their houses. They lived together, they worked together, often side by side. In the household, they might have cooked together, they might have grown up together, they might have even had sex together. It was a much more intimate scenario. And so these cases really show us a closer relationship. There's an awareness. Whites are much more aware of what enslaved Blacks are doing in their lives because they work so closely together. And as for free Blacks, many of them worked with whites on a regular basis because it wasn't nearly as, say, densely populated as other slave societies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes me wonder why so many people often forget or don't know that there was slavery up here in the North because of that close relationship. It doesn't look like it's not so obvious and upfront as maybe in the South.
Over the last 25 years, historians have done an excellent job of piercing that myth that slavery was just a Southern issue. It was endemic throughout New England, and we know that there is the noticeable slaveholding well into the 1850s in places like Connecticut and New Jersey. So that legacy of history saying it was just a Southern problem, historians are no longer saying that. And we're glad to say in classes we're not saying that either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, aside from free Black inhabitants in New London, there were also enslaved ones, of course. And they also found themselves embroiled in legal disputes in colonial New England. So another common type of case that you mentioned in your research is rightful ownership and freedom disputes.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the examples that you mentioned is the story of a woman called Joan and her family and their legal battles with the Rogers family. And I think this case really shows us how complicated these enslavement relationships really are. There could be one free person in the family while their parents are enslaved or their children are enslaved. So first, can you give us a bit more clarity about how you determine freedom status for an individual?
Sure. In colonial America, by custom, the status of a child generally followed the mother's status. So if an enslaved woman gave birth to a child, that child was automatically considered enslaved. This was a way to continue to perpetuate the institution without having to settle paternity claims. This was important in many of the Southern colonies enough that they wrote it into statutory law. Virginia wrote it into their law in the 1660s. Connecticut didn't do that until the 1790s, so well after the colonial period. But it appears that it was custom in Connecticut. We have evidence that the Connecticut Assembly recognized the custom that a child born to an enslaved mother would carry the enslaved status. And that was as early as 1704. So it seems pretty clear that the courts were very aware of that general expectation.
Mhm. And then how does all this confusion play into the story of Joan and her family?
Joan's case is a doozy. Joan's story is so complicated that every time I return to my research, I feel like I need to reconstruct this again to make sure that it's unfolding properly. I'll do my best to give a simple account of it. Um, uh, I had worked only from legal records, so it was really hard to piece it together. But about maybe 10 years ago, Allegra di Bonaventura wrote this beautiful book called For Adam's Sake. And she really adds kind of the social meat to my legal bones. And it's an absolutely fascinating story. We go back to the 1600s for Joan's case. She was born to a servant named Maria in the house of James Rogers Sr. Try to follow all the Rogerses in this story. We don't know who the father was to Joan, but there is some suspicions that it was probably James himself. Regardless, he ends up dying at a relatively young age in 1688. And his will called for the emancipation of all of his enslaved laborers. And there was kind of a presumption that that probably applied to Joan as well. And the reason why that's in debate is that before he died, he had loaned Joan out to his daughter Bathsheba. She and her husband Samuel Fox had assumed that Joan was their gift for life, so they did not immediately release her. In fact, Bathsheba had depended on Joan to help her care for her mother, the widow, who was stroke-addled and quite infirm. While living with the Foxes, Joan fell in love with a former slave named John Jackson, who had indentured himself to John Rogers, Bathsheba's brother. John Jackson and Joan Jackson, they started a family of their own. So the Foxes emancipated her in 1702, and they lived as a family on John Rogers' farm. So for a moment here, she's free, but that's not going to go uncontested for very long. So I introduce you to Elizabeth and Samuel Beebe. The will that emancipated James Rogers Sr.'s laborers also bequeathed 10 pounds to the Beebes. Instead of paying that money, however, the widow quite suspiciously gave them 2 copper kettles and the rights to claim ownership of Joan. So that's what 10 pounds was worth to the widow. The only evidence that we have to support this gift to the Beebes was a letter that was written while she was already infirm and was quite possibly forged. Nonetheless, decades after the fact, in 1709, the Beebes sued to claim Joan as part of their share of the will. Based on this letter alone from the widow, the court ruled in favor of the Beebes. And so the Beebes took Joan and her 2 youngest children to his home on Plum Island. Not long after that, the very angry John Jackson and his master, John Rogers, slipped across Long Island Sound in canoes in the cover of night, and they rescued her. They liberated her and the 2 children and took them back to the Rogers homestead. Samuel Beebe was furious, and he filed a criminal complaint in the New London County Court for the theft of his laborers. Rogers and Jackson both appeared, and they pleaded not guilty, but they were unapologetic. Jackson says, to quote, "She was taken away from me." I love this kind of competing ownership where we have coverture going up against enslavement. The county court disagreed with Rogers and Jackson, found them both guilty, and returned Joan to Beebe. To add insult to injury, the court also fined Rogers and Jackson 20 pounds in damages for stealing Joan away from the Beebes. But Jackson, as an indentured servant, could not afford this. So they sentenced him to service in Beebe's care. So this is a typical punishment for people who couldn't afford it, but it's doubly insulting. Now he has to serve Beebe as a master. It wouldn't take long. Beebe wanted nothing to do with the adults, in this case, Joan and John. And so he sold them off to a large landowner in New London, who then sold Joan off. It almost seems spiteful, sold him off to a merchant up in Boston. So Beebe now has this confirmed claim that he owns Joan, or had right to Joan, even though he sold her off. So he used that legal claim to file several more lawsuits to go get her children. And her children, who were also enslaved, but they were scattered amongst the Rogers family throughout New London. And what I find kind of interesting in this, he argued, look, these are the fruits of my labor, they belong to me. But in each of these cases, the court disagreed. The court was unwilling to disrupt their current placements. So we take about 20 years of litigation involving Joan and John, and we see that it really forced the judges to make some novel legal decisions. The statutory law didn't help them at all. So they had to come up with their own principles to guide them. And I think I identified three important principles that emerge from their cases. First, the county court was usually loath to move enslaved people from their, and I'm afraid to use this word, afraid to move them from their possessor at the time of trial. Right? We take Joan here. Joan was a free woman. She lived as a free woman with her husband on the Rogers homestead. But once her slave status reattached under Beebe's legal claim, the court refused to dislodge that right, even after she had run away. A second principle that the judges relied on is they seem to have resisted establishing a legal understanding that the gift of an enslaved laborer entitled the beneficiary to that laborer's children. They resisted this. Beebe and his family were unsuccessful in their efforts to claim title to all of Joan's children, even though Beebe had already asserted title to Joan herself. And then the third principle, and it's kind of related to the other two, is that the court seemed very reluctant to separate family members across great distances. When we read about studies in the South, we hear all sorts of tales of Southern slaveholders ripping families apart as part of a power move. But this isn't what happened to Joan and John Jackson's children. Aside from the two youngest, who were at too tender of an age to rip from the mother, the court repeatedly refused to send their children to Beebe's home in Long Island. In fact, Joan eventually does return to John in New London, and they're able to live fairly close to their children as they entered adulthood. Now, that's not the same as restoring the entire nuclear family, which would be the right thing to do. But there is kind of a sensitivity somewhat to keep them close together.
Oh, thank you. That's crazy, crazy story. So I'm also partial to the story of a woman you mentioned called Hagar, because her journey took her all the way to give testimony to defend her own freedom in front of the governor's council, which eventually became the Senate of Connecticut. So she goes all the way to the top in order to defend herself. Can you tell us a little bit about her story?
Yeah. So that's close to home for the old State House, right?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Coincidentally, she too had been initially enslaved in the household of James Rogers Sr. While she was living there, she married his indentured servant, William Wright. William Wright was of Indian descent. When William's 6-year term came to an end, he actually freed both of them. They lived free together. Eventually, William gets banished. He becomes part of the rabble-rousing Rogerines. And so he gets banished from the colony for disrupting church services and for breaching Sabbath. So it's a pretty harsh punishment. Most of the Rogerines were not pushed out. but I'm wondering if they laid heavily on him because of his background. Regardless, she remarried, and that husband died soon thereafter. So she had to make it on her own. She appears in the records again about a decade later. Um, for some reason, and I'm not sure what it is, she had to come to court to reassert her freedom. I suspect that her former owner's son, now James Jr., tried to reassert a claim for her, but I'm not sure. So she actually ends up testifying before the governor's council that she and her children were free by virtue of Rogers' decree, his emancipatory decree. The council heard her pleas and ordered her to appear more locally, to appear in the county court to assure the judges that she and her children were indeed free. So she went to the court. She recertified before them, and they agreed that no member of the Rogers family had any entitlement by will or bequest or gift to her services as an enslaved laborer. And she lives out the rest of her life in a free status. After the certification, she ended up actually going to James Jr. and purchasing 3 acres of land. While that might not be much land, she was able to secure. She lived securely enough to take care of her 6 children on her own. She farmed, she raised sheep, and even rented that sheep out, which means she's negotiating with other people. And in fact, I love this kind of nice ribbon to her story. She actually uses the New London County Court later when she moves. She successfully sued to enforce the sale of her land. Several years later, the court honors that and protects her property and interest.
Thank you so much. These women, they're just incredible. And I think there's another kind of case that you touch upon on your research is the fraudulent sale of slaves. So these really illustrate how enslaved people being treated as simply no more of a commodity that can be fraudulently sold and purchased. So one horrifying case that you mentioned is the kidnapping of a woman called Sarah. So can you tell us a little bit about Sarah and how she ended up in Connecticut?
Yep. So these fraudulent sale cases, they appear in 2 different forms. They are the first kind of fraudulent sale case is when the seller lacked the authority to actually sell a person. And secondly, there's this other subset of cases, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit, where the laborer is sold but isn't really fit for labor. Sarah's case is sad, but falls into the first category. Samuel Richards sold Sarah. Sarah was a woman of mixed racial background. Richards sold her to Edward Robinson, and she worked for him for 4 years before she ran away to Rhode Island. When she gets to Rhode Island, she told officials that she never should have been enslaved in the first place. She said that she was the daughter of a free Indian woman, thus tapping into that free status transfer to a newborn. And she said instead she was the victim of a kidnapping plot by slave speculators who must have been going around rounding up dark-skinned people to sell them into enslavement. And she said she was part of that, and those speculators had sold her to Richards. The Rhode Island court certified her freedom. She was able to secure that freedom. And in the Rhode Island court, she was actually able to get 55 pounds for back payment for wages due to her in service to Robinson. So she has this certification saying that she's free. Robinson uses that ruling in Connecticut, in New London County, to successfully sue Richards for selling the labor of a woman who was not to be enslaved in the first place.
Yeah, this goes to show the insidiousness of slavery, that even people that were born free were not truly protected or free of it.
Really. Absolutely.
All right, so let's see. A heartbreaking subject of these fraud cases was also the selling of sick individuals. Could you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that second subset of fraudulent sale cases are really heartbreaking because they underscore enslaved people's legal status as property. Um, at their heart, these fraud cases involve, to use a property term, the defects of laborers. I'm going to be using these air quotes a lot so that you don't think I think they're defective. Um, to sue in these cases, if somebody believed they had been defrauded by getting a sick enslaved person, to sue, these plaintiffs had to show four things that were really typical of consumer fraud cases. It's real alarming in this sense. A plaintiff had to show that a defendant intended to cheat or defraud the buyer. They had to show that the defendant was aware of the laborer's principal defects. Uh, the purchaser had to show, this plaintiff had to show that they were unaware of these defects or unable to discern these defects. And then the last element is they had to show a real injury, that the defects of the laborer threaten the safety or financial security of the buyer or the buyer's family. And so what's really depressing about this is that the foremost issue isn't about the health of the enslaved laborer. Instead, the focus was on their functional usefulness as a commodified property. Right? Many of these people, they came into the colony as sick, right? Many of them suffered depression. Some of them suffered blindness. They suffered skin diseases like the yaws. They suffered motor disabilities that was called, the most famous one was called St. Vitus's dance. Today we call it chorea. Or other maladies, whether they developed them in the stress of service or contracted them in carriage over the Middle Passage or from the Caribbean. And what makes these cases so awful is that the litigants use these purported defects against them as evidence of being defrauded.
Right. And there's one particular woman called Jenny who has just the most awful story. So can you tell us a little bit about Jenny?
Yeah, Jenny's case is really sad because she was clearly an untreated epileptic. And the case records show almost no sympathy for her at all. Jedediah Williams had acquired Jenny from Thomas Spalding. And Spalding had gave assurances of her health and fitness for work. But Jenny showed signs of epileptic fits soon after she came into Williams' home. One seizure was so bad that she fell into a kitchen fire, and that severely burned herself. In her kind of fit of panic, she tried to throw herself back into the fire. On another occasion, her fits were so bad that they bound her to a harrow to keep her from hurting herself or hurting others. Williams was certain he was a victim of deliberate fraud, so he sued Spalding. And the evidence suggested pretty overwhelmingly that Spalding had long known of her illness because he had witnessed them themselves. He had heard rumors about it before he had purchased her, and then worse, saw it in his own household. And witnesses came forward saying, yeah, Spalding knew about it. In fact, he even bade us to stay quiet so that we wouldn't interrupt the sale. And so the New London County Court awarded Williams 84 pounds for his injury. And then kind of the sad coda here is that Jenny disappears from the record. There's no mention of her health or her future circumstances. She just disappears. She's just a kind of an element of Williams' economic injury.
It's just awful. But and I feel terrible changing the subject so abruptly. But besides all of these civil cases, there were also a couple of criminal cases that you touched upon during your research, and Black inhabitants being both charged as criminals themselves and being also the victims of crimes. So, can you tell us a little bit some examples of each of these?
Sure. Like much to my surprise, I didn't find many African descendant related cases in the criminal record. Remember, my mindset was, oh, I'm just going to find a bunch of murder. And that didn't happen. But even finding lower level crimes, I didn't find a lot of them. But I can give you kind of some examples of when they were either a victim or they were an accused defendant in these cases. As a victim, the Bushnell brothers brought suit against two Indians named Will, Tom, and Peter for the bloody beating of their enslaved laborer, Robin. The evidence is pretty gruesome, even for a colonial case. They found blood on the highway. They found blood on the rocks. They even found blood in the pasture. And as proof of how injured he was, poor Bushnell brothers said he was so injured he couldn't even work. So they brought suit against Will, Tom, and Peter, or brought charges against Will, Tom, and Peter. And it has a really unsatisfactory ending because Will, Tom, and Peter didn't appear in court. They didn't show up. And so this case doesn't show up in the records anymore. There's no resolution to the case. It just shows kind of that tension between Will, Tom, and Peter and Robin. I don't know what precipitated it. I don't know what the end results are, but you can see they're really concerned about his fitness for work. In terms of being a defendant, I can use as a case, a Mohegan Indian named Cha-Cha brought suit against Benoni Phillips for theft. He accused Phillips of stealing 6 beaver pelts from a roadside stand that he had been running, and then taking those pelts with grave offense, selling them to another white man. Phillips had insisted, look, I purchased these fair and square from the stand, but I didn't purchase them from Cha-Cha. I purchased them from another Mohegan Indian who was working at the stand. His name was Robert Ashpo. So when the case initially gets to the New London County Court, Phillips loses. Ashpo kind of turns on his heel and says, look, Phillips didn't buy these from me. I was actually sleeping and he definitely stole them. I don't have any evidence. I suspect that if Phillips wasn't lying, then maybe Ashpo was. Maybe he actually did sell those pelts and didn't want to get in trouble for it. So he just said, nah, it's crazy. I was sleeping. So Phillips loses this case. But one thing that I think is really impressive is in the next court session, Philip refiles the case for review. This is a typical action. We don't have this today. This is like going to the court and saying, come on, try it again. But this time he brings 8 character witnesses with him. And most of them were white, including Phillips's former slaveholders. And the former slaveholders assured the court he could not have done this because he's a good Christian man and can recite the Bible. And more importantly, and it's kind of derogatory and sad, but they said maybe the judges didn't understand what he was saying because he speaks so poorly. So it's a little backhanded slap, but Philip refiled the case. And by bringing white witnesses to support him, he was able to win the case and get acquitted.
That's so interesting. So why do you think there are, or that you found so few criminal cases in the New London County courts concerning Black inhabitants?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I don't have like a singular reason, but there's a couple that might suggest why this has happened. First of all, the county court only gives a narrow view of criminal activity. The real sexy crimes, the real severe crimes, especially those that involve life or limb, they don't appear in the county court. They appear in the superior court or upwards in the kind of the tree of courts. So what you see are mostly what I would call low level or petty crimes like theft and assault. Those are actually the 2 most common outside of sexual offenses. So that might explain why there were a few number of cases, but there might also be some social considerations here for enslaved Blacks. It might be that the discipline for improper behavior might have been held within the slaveholder's prerogative behind closed doors. So there might have been side conversations that didn't involve the court that ended up in punishment, or as slaveholders would call it, correction. Plus, a lot of slaveholders would not want these cases coming to court because these would turn into public conversations about his inability to master properly. And then in kind of in a related explanation, it's also possible that many people might not have thought that offenses against Black victims were worth pursuing in court. And if that suggestion is the case, right, that further reinforces the dehumanizing conditions of enslavement and racial subordination. The problem is, we can't ever know, why aren't these things in court? Well, because they're not there. But these suggestions kind of help me explain why so few criminal cases show up and why perhaps they might have been handled beyond our view.
All right. So, Dominic, we've talked about debt cases and fraudulent sale cases and rightful ownership and freedom dispute cases and some criminal cases. So based on all of your research and all of these cases that you've looked into, what would you like people to know about regarding Black participation in the court system during colonial times, based on all of these cases that we've talked about?
That's a good one. What do I want you to walk away with? Maybe the most important thing to take away from this is that their appearances in court, Black people's appearances in court, help record their life stories. Many aspects of Black life simply go unrecorded. The controls over literacy and historians' dependence on the printed word makes it really hard to get at the day-to-day lives. And so the court records are one way to tell these stories. But I also want you to walk away with, and this might be a bit too Pollyanna, but I also want to kind of give credit, some appreciation for the due processes and the practices laid out by the English common law and their adoption by colonists, that they tried to turn the court into some sort of safe place for dispute resolution. We have such a limited view on detailed white-Black relations in general. So the court records show us one place where Blacks might have been treated relatively fairly, especially compared to general social relations.
Thank you. And so my final question before we head off to questions from the audience, we do have a couple.
Okay.
So could you say that these cases in New London serve as a sample of how racial relations were working in the greater Connecticut colony courts? Could we assume that things were similar in other counties around Connecticut at the time?
I'm a historian. I'm not allowed to assume anything. I may make relative comparisons.
Right.
So the court structures were really similar across the colony. So if we just looked at the laws, the court structures, the procedures, and the applications, we could say that possibly these same things carried out. But I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to speak for all of the counties because New London County's population counts for people of color were 3 times larger than any other county in Connecticut. They made up, it's not a sizable, but it's noticeable. About 6% of the population was made up of people of color. It kind of makes sense that there would be a lot more Black inhabitants with New London County's proximity to Boston with the Boston Post Road, their proximity to Newport, which becomes the enslavement trade capital of the North. Plus its ties to the sea with New London traffic coming in and out of the Caribbean. So it would make sense that there would be more African descendant interactions in New London County. So I'm not willing to speak for all the counties. New London County might indeed be unique, but this sounds like a really good project for somebody else to do.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I just really, just want to point out how much research there's still left to do, how many things we can still find in these court records, and how many stories are left to be told.
So if I can speak to that just briefly, the same grant that Bruce Stark had to process the New London County records, he also got them for, now I'm blanking. It's the county opposite in the northwest county above Fairfield. But he also processed those records People on the feed right now are just screaming at me. I apologize. I moved away for too long. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But
And
they
I'm
have,
relatively new to Connecticut.
so it is there where he also processed records there. I don't know if there's a collection guide for specifically for African descendants, but I do know that he meticulously processed those records with that grant. So that might be an easy project for somebody to simply pick up and run with to find a comparison with my research. I would definitely welcome that.
Absolutely. Well, Dominic, thank you so much. That was super, super interesting, super important stories to hear. And we do have a couple of questions from our viewers.
Excellent.
Did get a couple from registration.
Oh, nice.
Pre-submitted questions. So Heidi would like to know, how carefully were records kept as to the outcomes of trials involving Black citizens?
Yeah. So, hi, Heidi. Thanks for the question. The records are beautiful. I mean, for a colonial historian, as long as you don't mind reading manuscript cursive handwriting, which many of my students cannot do anymore, the records are waiting for you. You don't have to be a lawyer to do it. I've worked with many legal historians who are not attorneys or trained lawyers. It might need some special help in reading some of the shorthand, but usually in all of the records, the trial records tell you exactly how cases ended or why they couldn't be resolved. So that part is great. It doesn't often give us the dateline 6 months later, how are people doing, but it does give us a really good sense of what happened. Even on some of the file papers that are recorded with the court, if they had to file executions, and executions is just a legal term for carrying out the court's orders, they'll tell you exactly what they did in handwriting. The sheriff will go out and say, hey, you owed this person 40 pounds. You've been charged 40 pounds. We're going to take 40 pounds of land or oats or flax or other goods. So the records are really good. The one thing that I did struggle with, though, is that there isn't a lot of detail with Black lives on kind of a personal level. So you have to do a lot of supplemental reading with it as well. There's this beautiful compendium called Black Roots in southeastern Connecticut, where researchers in the 1980s actually went through and tried to identify every mention of a Black person and kind of give you kind of a blurb for each one. So for each person, whether they had a last name or not, it's really well detailed, and that's a great starting point for connecting the social with the legal. So I think you'll find that the records are really meticulous, really good.
Great, thank you. And we do have some folks in the chat asking if it's Litchfield, the county.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Litchfield.
Thank you, chat people. Yes, that's the one.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Martha is asking, how did Venture Smith use the courts in New London County in the 18th century?
I've got the best historical answer on this. I don't know. My survey, because I wanted to cover every case and not just sample them, I gave myself a narrow window. And I initially set it from 1700 to 1750 because that's where Bruce's notes were at the time I was working on them. He hadn't quite processed the ones after that. So Venture Smith, if I remember right, doesn't come to Connecticut till the mid 1750s. So this is somebody who is well recorded in court records. He was an entrepreneur of his own. He had worked as both, I think it's enslaved and indentured or in service, but also did some farming, cut some wood, which is going to put him in the marketplace. And when you enter the marketplace, it usually means you enter the courts. And I'm sure Venture made his way, if not in the superior courts, also lower into the county courts or used justices of the peace. Unfortunately, he did not come up during any of my research, because if Venture Smith had shown up, it probably would have doubled the length of anything I've written so far about Black experiences. But for more on that, in case you don't know already, John Woodsweet has done excellent work on Venture Smith. Saw him in the archives actually working on it. So follow John Sweet's work if you want more on Venture Smith. Definitely more than I can offer.
All right, you're giving us a lot of reading material, a lot of recommendations.
Everything's a book club with me.
Yeah. So Alan Ramsey from the chat does say that, yes, it is Litchfield County court records and that there is a minorities collection available there.
Excellent. I know Bruce also did the same for Native Americans in New London. So I would assume that if his time allotted before he retired, that he did the same for Native Americans too. So students out there, researchers out there, there's so much good stuff to work on. Go get it.
There are still ideas to find.
There's plenty of ideas. The Connecticut State Library is just this beautiful repository of historical artifacts, documents, papers. There's plenty of work to be done there.
Right. So we have another question. This one from Patrick. He says, presumably Black litigants were seldom represented by counsel, so literacy would have been required. Yeah. If the premise is correct, how did the free Blacks, if any Blacks, become literate?
Well, I hate to say this, Patrick, but the premise isn't correct. For the most part, definitely after, say, the 1720s, when attorneys become much more visible, attorneys would represent any litigants. And I do have plenty of cases where these cases were put forth by attorneys. For those of you who are not familiar with how attorneys would be acquired, might be why they got kind of a bad rap. On court days, which is the designated days for when court would meet, attorneys would just stand out front of court and they would take anybody. And they often worked in pairs and handled cases in pairs. In New London, the attorneys come a little bit later. So they come a little bit later, but it's really hard to tell who the literate folk are because most of the legal records are recorded either by attorneys if they're active. Almost all the paperwork is done by clerks. All the records are recorded by clerks, and many of the executions are written out by sheriffs. So there are plenty of legal officials that could help an unliterate person navigate the courts. But it's definitely absolutely fascinating, and it's probably something I should have dived deeper into. But attorneys are helping people out in these cases, including Black litigants.
Thank you. Okay, so we have our last question here. If anybody else has any other questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments section. We might have time for one more, maybe.
Okay.
So I apologize if I mispronounced this name, but Mineagle asked from YouTube, what were some of the more common occupations of free Blacks that you came across? What does it suggest about the standards of living of these individuals?
Yeah. So I want to confess a frustration. In other colonies, they would regularly list professions of people. And so you'll see, John Smith, farmer, John Smith, seafarer, shipwright. In the New London County records, for whatever reason, the clerk at the county court level rarely wrote down what somebody's profession was. The only exception is if they were a mariner. They wanted to signal that this was somebody who might be transient or from abroad or tied to the sea. For the most part, occupations are rarely there. So you kind of have to glean from some of this work or who they were living with to determine what they might have done. So if you were working in a Rogers household, the Rogerines were not only farmers, but they notoriously took on what they thought of as noble trades in simple service to God. So they might have, working alongside the Rogers, they might be bakers. They could be shoemakers or cordwainers, as they called them. So they might carry the trade. For the most part, the presumption is because there's a lot of landed work that they were doing regular husbandry. But there are others who are much more dynamic. For those of you who are familiar with Joshua Hempstead, his enslaved laborer Adam went with him everywhere. And Hempstead was a man of all trades. He was a farmer, he was a retailer or merchant. He also made most of the headstones in the ancientest burial grounds in New London. And so the presumption is that Adam is by his side at all times. Now, I know that those are examples of enslaved people, but they do take their trades and their skills with them outside of that. Unfortunately, the court records don't always tell us. This is why debt records can be so frustrating, is we see all of this money changing hands, but we don't know why. So the presumption is that a lot of them are working the farms, but we also know that some of them are heading to sea. Sea is giving them an opportunity to work on ships where they're learning an entirely different trade. And we have a sizable number of free Blacks working on ships as well.
All right, thank you. And we got one more question. This one's from Evan from YouTube. What would be your number one piece of advice for someone who's just starting to dive into these records? It's a great question.
No, it is a great question. If you're diving into these, there's many pieces of advice. First of all, be patient. Reading 18th and 17th century manuscript is like a foreign language, but much easier because at least if you know English, you have some foundations. But you have to be patient. It's going to take you a long time to get comfortable with reading this, and do not fear asking questions, whether it's of the archivists who have seen these things inside and out, or if you're dealing with court records. Don't be afraid to ask a legal historian very basic questions that you think are basic or complicated. We can walk you through all of that. I mean, that's what we're here for. We're trained. We love sharing this information. So be patient. Know that you're not going to have full stories, that it takes a lot of work to create full stories. And, don't be upset if you don't have the complete story. Our job is to recapture as much of the stories as possible. So be patient and ask for help.
Thank you. Excellent advice for lots of things besides research. All right, Dominic, thank you so much for being with us today. This was an amazing conversation that we've had, and also thank you everybody for joining us tonight.
Yes.
Before we sign off, I would just like to mention some of our upcoming programs here at the Old State House. We do have the Amistad trilogy coming up. Of programs focused on the Amistad, which is a famous court trial, speaking of trials, that took place at the Old State House. The first half of the trial took place at the Old State House. So the first program in the series is on next Tuesday, actually, February 28th at noon. This one is the Amistad trial. We'll be speaking with Tammy Denise, Charles Warner, and Adrian Joy Burns. Then the next one will be next month in March 28th, also at noon. The Amistad Rebellion in History and Film with Marcus Rediker. And finally, in April, Lessons of the Amistad Through the Lens of an African-Centered Woman with Paula Ann Agnew. And these are all part of the Amistad trilogy. These are all online, so you can check out our Facebook page or our website for more information and to register for this. And again, thank you so much, Dominic. This was great. And thank you very much, everybody. There is a post-program survey linked in the program description of the video. So if you'd like to let us know how we did, what we can do better, and ideas for future programming, we would love to hear your feedback. So thank you so much, Dominic.
Thanks for having me anytime. I'd love to come back.
Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
You too.